Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Narayanan and you're watching on AP 13's the AP Microeconomics series. Today we're going to be answering what governments are involved with microeconomics and macroeconomics in general. So let's get started. Last time we answered different questions about what type of goods, how much input, and who gets final goods, all about the product market. As always, click right there for the link for that video. Today, we're going to be discussing, as you can tell, about the economy. We're going to answer economy systems, what types there are, and the same sort of idea, economy governments, what types there are, and how each one is slightly different. So let's get started. As always, we ask ourselves, what are we going to be discussing today? We're going to be discussing the three different systems. We're going to discuss communism, socialism, and capitalism. And yes, there is a difference between all three of them. Some people relate socialism and communism as similar. They are similar, but not exactly the same. We're also going to be talking about the pros and cons of both. So let's get started with communism. Communism is the system to negate any sense of wealth inequality. It's the system to negate any sense of wealth inequality. If you have to choose one, you've got to choose this one for this specific trait. It's got one political party which divides the wealth among all the different citizens to be able to best form a equal society. This party is called, obviously, the Communist Party. Now, the pros and cons above, you can see some of the countries that are deemed to be communist. Now, there is no official communist country out there, although there are countries that are pretty close. China, Cuba, and Vietnam, for example, all are pretty close to that communist comparison. So the pros of communism: there are no class systems. There's no upper class or middle class or lower class. Everybody's in the same class, which is however much money they have, that's the class they're in. Unemployment is basically gone because with a system of communism, everybody has a job, everybody's got to work. It gives citizens basic needs to survive. They don't have to worry about whether or not food can be put on the table. They've got their food. They have dictators and powers, and while this may seem originally kind of problematic, dictators and powers actually are the most efficient way of being able to make legislation go by. You can see, for example, in the United States, our Congress isn't particularly great at passing bills on the fly, but dictators, if they have an idea, they make it a law. It's pretty efficient. And finally, a strong and safe country. Obviously, with communist governments and communist systems of economies, you're going to have a strong country because people are going to have a job of being in the army, and they're going to be in the army. You don't have to worry about people going to a draft or anything like that. As always, however, communism has a couple of cons that kind of blow the idea apart. Number one, the dictator and power thing. You don't know who they are. Are you lucky enough to have a dictator that actually cares for the people, or are you more likely to get a corrupt dictator? This could be slightly problematic, leading to a lot of issues. Anti-ambition from the workers themselves, that the workers are getting paid the exact same, and one guy works 20 hours a day and the other guy works 4 hours a day. They're both getting paid the same. There's not really much incentive to work hard. It can also fuel poverty, and this kind of goes against the idea of unemployment being gone and giving citizens basic needs. But at the same time, if everybody's equally broke, then that's a con for the communist system. Corruption, as mentioned before, not necessarily just for the leaders, but also legislators in general. The critical role of the central government in allocating resources makes the system particularly vulnerable to corruption throughout the entire section. And people get no say, as mentioned before. The dictators do have the efficiency on their side, but they also don't have that whole democracy thing that's kind of important to everybody in the world today. Next up, socialism. And as you can see here, the two different aspects. Well, on one side, socialism is, sharing, and on the other side, socialism is not sharing. It aims to fairly distribute wealth and incentivize workers, using trade unions and managers to be able to make sure that equal wages are made and things like that. It's similar to communism in ideals and goals, which is why people confuse them a lot. Socialism comparisons, you can see a couple of them there, most prominently on the left, India, and on the right, Portugal. You can also see the last country is North Korea, and a lot of people are confused at why North Korea is not considered a communist nation, considering they are a dictatorship with one party ruling and everything like that. And that's mainly because of the constitution itself. It actually states that they are a socialist government, although running very close to being a communist government. This effectively could be placed under either one, just because of the Constitution that placed it here, and the fact that they used to be a really strict communist country back in the 80s and 70s before leaning away from that and now leaning back towards that with their leader currently. Pros of socialism is the idea that you see a lot of hardcore extreme progressives talking about all people getting free education, free healthcare, which in and of itself has benefits and drawbacks. But looking at it purely from the freedom perspective, free education and free healthcare is a good thing, although costs of that may cause tricky situations. Classless society, as mentioned before, without class, everybody's all good. Wealth equality, as mentioned before, if everybody's equally wealthy or equally unwealthy, then it leads to better situations. No monopolies, which is a really, really big thing. Without a monopoly, nobody's really controlling any sort of market. You can choose whether or not you want to purchase from this guy or that guy, which helps, prices be lower, more affordable for people, and more people able to buy whatever that monopoly would have been selling. Cons, however, the government still has full control over the situation, or near full control, which is not necessarily a good thing. Higher taxes, which is something that a lot of people don't like. Higher taxes are needed to pay for this free education and free healthcare, which could be a problem. You have to deal with a lot of bureaucracy. A lot of that has to be done, which is something that people don't like going through. It's like waiting at the DMV. It's not necessarily the best thing you want to do. And government unnecessary spending. You might have to worry about your government spending on things that aren't necessarily important to the people. So, for example, if education is already really, really good, and the government continues to spend on education rather than healthcare, which for the said country is extremely poor, then the government is unnecessarily spending tax dollars on something that may or may not be useful. So, socialist governments, as you can tell, is a anti-conservative idea. And the final one is capitalism. Now, capitalism is basically when private individuals control the factors of production and end up using it to do the one thing that everybody loves to do, make a profit. Wages between managers and the employees of the union, not necessarily government involvement at all. Supply and demand determines the market focus, and the government, as I mentioned, is not as involved as in the previous two scenarios. Now, the pros and cons, you can see around 3 different countries that are really, really big on capitalism. Now, there is no such thing as a purely capitalistic country, because that would mean that the government has absolutely no say, or very, very, very limited say, with the ideas of Adam Smith and the invisible hand. But some countries, when you think of capitalism, you think of these countries are the United States, Great Britain. I put Canada in there because Canada's never mentioned, so this is a small shout out to all the Canadian watchers. The pros of capitalism: economic freedom, which equals political freedom. As you can see, all 3 of these countries here that are not only capitalistic, they also are pretty free politically as well compared to other countries. They are efficient economically. Now, economic efficiency, we're going to mention in the future, are basically the way of making sure that everybody has an equal price and a price that's fair for them. Economic growth. Economic growth is really important for being able to sustain a capitalistic country. As the economy grows, more people can buy things, which can grow the economy and leads to a cyclical sort of movement. And people have a say, most of the say, in fact, with a capitalistic country. Now, obviously, without a pure capitalistic country, we won't know if people really have 100% of the say. However, in countries like the US and Great Britain, people have a say in what they're going to purchase and what they're going to make. Companies, for example, can choose whether to sell something or not sell something. However, even with capitalism, there are cons. So, for example, monopoly or monopsony, which we will discuss later, have complete power. Now, if you've ever played the game Monopoly, you kind of understand what a monopoly is. A monopoly is when you control all of the aspects of one specific field. So, for example, if all of the cell phone companies that give service, so for example, AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon, and other ones, all merged together to become one large company, and then sold, cellular service, they would be a monopoly and would basically be free to charge whatever they want without any problems because you can't go to anybody else. Social benefit is kind of ignored when using a purely capitalistic ideology, because supply and demand decides everything, including whether or not somebody can purchase something, even if it would be beneficial to sell it, but not necessarily economically beneficial. Wealth inequality is also a big problem with capitalism. You've got some people with capitalistic at the extreme rich, and at the same time, you've got a couple of people at the extreme poor. And finally, boom and bust cycles. With the other two systems, you don't necessarily see economic cycles as you do in capitalistic countries. So you can see a bull market and a bear market, for example, if you're using Wall Street terms. That's going to be it, actually. Now, I want to pose a question to you. What system do you think is best theoretically, practically, or is it a mix that would be best theoretically or practically? Go ahead and leave that in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. Go ahead and subscribe, leave a comment, like, follow me on any social media website with the links in the description, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, take care.